Jazz is often made more complicated than it needs to be. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use 2 ingredients to create some great sounding jazz licks. And as you'll see, this is a process you can apply to pretty much any song or chord. A huge part of what makes a jazz solo sound like jazz is that the solo follows the chords. And in that way spells out the different colors of what is going on in the harmony, like this. The simple way of following the harmony is just to use the arpeggios or the chords that you solo over, so that what you're playing in your solo matches what is being played in the chords. So the first ingredient is an arpeggio, like this C major 7 arpeggio. Another important part of especially the bebop sound is to use chromatic phrases like approach notes, short enclosures, and long enclosures. And already combining arpeggios with chromatic phrases like these, you can quite easily make some very solid jazz lines. My name is Larsen, learn jazz, make music. Let's start with the C major 7. A simple place to start is to play it as a triplet and add a leading note before the arpeggio. You can add more dense and complicated chromatic phrases, which will give you some pretty advanced sounding lines, but that'll come later in the video. This simple version is actually bebop gold. As you can probably tell, this already starts to sound like bebop, and it's something you can move around to pretty much any chord or arpeggio that you can think of. Not only 7th chords, but it also sounds beautiful on, for instance, a minor 9th chord. Right now you're only using a single chromatic leading note before the arpeggio, so let's add some more chromaticism by the end of the arpeggio. For the C major 7, this gives you a lick that's a favorite of Charlie Parker, and that I'm pretty sure George Benson transcribed from him, because he plays it all the time as well. Really all that's happening here is that the arpeggio is followed by a chromatic phrase connecting the 7th, so the B, down to the 5th, the G. And this is just done by going down the scale and adding half steps. Let's look at how you can make this a little bit longer with a chromatic enclosure. This example is using an A minor 7 arpeggio, and the melody leading into it is a short enclosure. The formula for this first enclosure is diatonic above, chromatic below. The target note is A, and the note above that in the scale is a B, and then the chromatic note below that would be a G sharp. And this is a very useful way to create some chromatic movement and still have melodies that sound natural and make sense to the ear. For an A minor 7 arpeggio, that will give you this exercise. The arpeggio runs up to the 7th and then moves down in half steps to F, and then the F is the first part of the enclosure of the 5th, so we go down with a chromatic leading note and then end on the 5th of A minor, E. But you can do even more with some of the longer chromatic phrases. Adding a more extensive chromatic phrase like this is a great way to lead into the arpeggio. It makes the line more surprising, it gives it some movement before it really connects to the chord, which is really how we use these chromatic phrases, as small bits of outside melody that create tension, which resolves once we hit the target note. In this example, the lick continues with a short enclosure of the 5th, and then just ending on the last note, the 3rd, the E, on the one end. You can also use chromatic phrases like this one on the high note of the arpeggio, and that's going to give you some other great effects. This example adds a leading note before the arpeggio and then tags it with a longer chromatic phrase before the last note. The way this is done, it adds a nice large 5th interval skip into the line. Until now, the chromatic phrases are before or after the phrase, but of course you can also add them inside the arpeggio, which will make the line a lot less obvious, a lot less arpeggio sounding, but still give it a natural flow. This example is built around the A minor 7 arpeggio, and then I'm using first a leading note for the root, and then an enclosure, a short enclosure for the 3rd, and a short enclosure for the 5th. And then from here I just move up the arpeggio all the way up to the 9 and then end on the root. But you can also get great sounds with longer chromatic phrases. The next thing you can explore is to also start using the inversions of the arpeggios, and in that way get access to a lot of great sounding new melodies. Here you have an inversion of G7. The lick is built around this descending first inversion G7 arpeggio. First we get a leading note for the 7th and then a short enclosure of the 3rd. So it starts on the root, then we get a leading note to the 7th, then down the arpeggio and then a short enclosure of the 3rd, and then skipping up to the root again in this nice melodic 6th interval. As you can tell, this is really opening up for what you can do, and you can create some really great lines with arpeggios and inversions. One technique that's really a beautiful and important part of the bebop sound is octave displacement, and that is one of the techniques that you can get started using if you check out this video on the most important bebop licks, because that will teach you how to start working with octave displacement and how to use that in your own solos. And this is something that can really change how your solos sound, so go check that out.